This is Michael Rauscher, and I am the host of Judgment Free Zone, which is a fairly new podcast. Judgment Free Zone is a podcast that you can find pretty much anywhere today, as far as like Apple and Spotify, iHeart Radio. It's on all of the main platforms, but it started, if I'm being honest, it started probably 2 years ago. You just never heard of it then. It was in my mind. It was something I really wanted to do. Primarily, I wanted to start a podcast where I could just exercise my own voice, if you will, and just kind of share my own story. And that's how it began. So 2 years ago, I just, out of fear, if you will, and doubt, I decided to put it off. I started looking into it. I was ready to get it going, and then I put it off. I didn't do anything with it. This year, 2023, I finally decided it was time. And there were a few reasons that kind of gave me that push finally, but it was definitely time. I wanted to open myself up, be much more vulnerable than I've ever been, and I did that right out of the gate. So I guess that kind of goes into like your first question here of what inspired me to start podcasting. Well, I was diagnosed in 2017 with bipolar. I actually am one of only 20% of America that shares two personality disorders. So I'm bipolar as well as borderline personality disorder. So it has not been an easy road for me because I'm pretty certain I've had these issues for a long, long time. But for multiple reasons, personal reasons, I didn't even want to go about getting a diagnosis. A lot of that has to do with the fact that I was a single father. And, when you're a single dad and you're doing the best you can and you come from a good place and you love your children and you're giving them the best shot at life, you're afraid to get a diagnosis or have the courts be involved or somebody calling you crazy and giving them ammunition and those kinds of things. So for a lot of reasons, I put off getting a diagnosis. When I finally did, it really was the best thing for me because it really helped me get on a path of growth. But that path has continued, and today I'm experiencing phenomenal growth in my personal life and just in my own journey. So I started Judgment Free Zone for two reasons. One, I wanted to finally just put myself out there, my diagnosis on display, talk about it, how it personally has affected me in my life, the negatives as well as how to overcome the negatives and get to a positive, right? So that's where I started with the podcast. But in doing that, I wanted to not just make it about myself and my story. I really wanted to open up the platform to other people and their stories as well, whether that was a struggle with mental health or whether that was a struggle with addiction, whether that might have been a struggle just with other forms of mental health or suicide ideation, or even people who have just been in really negative situations where they've faced a lot of trauma and had to overcome. Similar to Amanda Blackwood and the trauma that she faced in her situation, similar to Diane Diaz, who was a guest on my podcast, who was in a narcissistic marriage for 25 years and faced a lot of trauma and abuse there. So I just wanted to open up this platform and have it be like a very open, very real, heart-wrenching kind of conversations, whatever the conversations needed to be, that we would open up and have them. I believed that it was allowing me to heal and grow and taking part in these conversations. Hopefully my guests felt that way, and I believe the listeners are feeling that way just based on the responses that I've gotten. So not sure if I even answered what inspired me, but it was just getting out there. It was just the idea of being vulnerable. I knew that you could only go so far in one's growth and self-development and self-love if you weren't willing to really open yourself up and just go all out, right? So that's why I really did that. Obtaining guests for the show, I've used Podmatch primarily. I found a few guests via social media, Facebook, and a few groups where I've connected with people in groups on Facebook. But I would say 90% of the guests that I've had thus far on Judgment Free Zone have come through Podmatch. Um, I will say some of the guests that I've had already have been amazing, phenomenal guests, and I thank Podmatch for that primarily because I've been able to really utilize the filters and find some great people to meet with. I have 12 episodes now of Judgment Free Zone, and we're doing great. I've got plenty of guests lined up to continue creating new content as we move into 2024. I would say some of the better highlights, if you will, some of the guests that I've talked to that have just really blown me away. I mean, all of them in their own way, but I met a girl, the very first guest that I really had is somebody that I met locally at a T-Mobile store. She worked at the T-Mobile. Her and I just started talking. I mentioned that I was starting this podcast. One thing led to another, and she opened up to me a little bit about her own journey. And then we recorded a podcast episode. So her name is Lainey. Lainey is today she's married, she's a mom, but she struggled for years with substance abuse. This is somebody who, because of the drug use, it also put her down on a dark path where she was involved in prostitution. Prostituting, not even to support herself or her child, who she had, but to support the drug habit. That's how serious it was. So Lainey is an individual like so many of us that just, she struggled with childhood trauma, parents who were addicts and in and out of jail. Her and her sister got turned on to drug use at a young age, starting with marijuana use, and then it increased into much harder drugs, including that of like heroin use and crystal meth. Which the shocking thing about that is today Lainey is clean. She's working so hard to stay clean. She takes good care of her son, who she shares with his father. Um, and as I mentioned, she's married today. She has an amazing support system, but she never was able to afford or actually go through rehab, the process of rehab. Lainey's rehab, if you will, was just support groups that she found herself, working the programs, working the system, being vulnerable, being able to share her story, utilizing her faith. These are the things that helped Lainey kick her habit and have helped her to remain clean for several years now. So, as I mentioned, she's nearby too. So it's amazing. I got the help I needed at a T-Mobile store. I made a lifelong friend out of it, and I met my first real guest for the podcast, and had um, no idea the impact that her and I would have on each other, or that she would have on my show by sharing her story. So uh, that right there is amazing. Just starting this podcast and the way it's branched out, and the individuals that I've been able to meet, the stories that I've been able to hear and share with a wider audience, it's amazing. And certainly the reason I wanted to do this is because I know there's people out there just like me that were feeling like, oh, I've got one issue after another, and I don't want to talk about it. I don't want the judgment. And so you bottle it up, you keep it all on the inside, and it eats away at you. Again, it prevents all those other things that I was talking about. It prevents the healing, it prevents self-growth. More importantly, it prevents self-love. It is so hard to love yourself when you're constantly beating yourself up. And I know that all too well. So one of the things that I did in the first episode of my podcast, where it was just myself speaking and kind of introducing the podcast, I talked a lot how I wanted to touch on subjects like domestic violence. I wanted to touch on subjects such as, child abuse. I wanted to touch on sexual abuse. I wanted to obviously touch on divorce and family. I wanted to touch on faith. I wanted to touch on mental illness, excuse me, and mental health. So far in 12 episodes, I have been able to touch on all of those subjects, and not just having to speak about it by myself or what I've experienced, either personally or through my family and friends, but being able to share this with all the different guests that I've had. I've had a plethora of guests already in just 12 short episodes, a plethora of guests where we've already talked about sexual abuse, where we've talked about domestic violence and domestic abuse, where we've talked in great deal about mental health, the struggles as well as the overcoming of mental health. We have talked about We've talked about food shortages in America and how we can help to overcome that. We've talked about human trafficking. We have talked about narcissism and in the depths of a narcissistic relationship, or, the red flags and stuff, to look at the true narcissist, not just kind of the trendy term that gets thrown out a lot, but what a real narcissist really looks like and behaves like. We've talked about addictions. We've talked about both drug addiction as well as sexual addiction and other addictions that are taking place. And then one of the another guest that I just had recently, somebody who holds her PhD and wrote an amazing few books already. Her and I just had a conversation where we'll be recording the follow-up to here shortly, but it was really just about America today, our country, and the crisis that we see it in, just all over the place, right? The crisis that we see both economically and religiously, if you will. Maybe that's not the right term, but faith. There's such a lack of faith today in our country, for multiple reasons. People are just like mad at it, or they shy away from it. And again, this goes back to, I mention all of these things because it really goes back to why I called the show Judgment Free Zone. So a guest of mine, we just had this talk about judgment. We talked about this on the show. He said maybe him and I were going to disagree a little bit because he saw judgment as a good thing. But as him and I discussed and explored that, we realized we were on the same page. To me, judgment is a good thing when it comes from within. I can judge myself. I can look within and say, hey, come on, there are certain things, behaviors, whatever patterns that I've done in my past. They're not okay. They have to be seen for what they are. They have to be addressed. They have to be broken. They have to be improved upon. That's me judging myself, and that's good judgment. That's important. The bad judgment, though, is when it's somebody on the outside who is judging you for something that maybe you don't even really have control of, or that you just struggle with, and you desperately want to talk about it. You desperately want to bring it out to the open and get help, but it's that judgment from the outsiders that makes you suppress it, right? So Judgment Free Zone was about that right there. It was about, let's talk about it. Let's get it out without that feeling of judgment, without the fear and the insecurity and all the things that, what is everybody going to say, or how are they going to look at me? That's what Judgment Free Zone was about. I've created, I believe, a very safe space for people to have real conversations without feeling judged, and be vulnerable and open themselves up. The best judgment, the true judgment, just has to come from within. I do agree with that. I've been able to judge myself, but today I do it very differently. I don't beat myself up. I recognize these things that I know I need to correct, and then I work towards correcting them, and sharing that with an audience or with a guest. It helps tremendously. I mean, we are created to share as human beings, and we're created to love. We need to learn how to love ourselves so that we can truly love others in whatever capacity, that's meant to be. The podcast has helped me with that tremendously. The goal, obviously, is to just keep helping people, guests and listeners alike. Let's see. Behind the scenes look at my production process. It's not overly complicated. I have some basic podcast equipment. I've got a home office because I work from home. So I pretty much do all my recordings here in the home office. I do have two different laptops. Sometimes I switch out with. One is just a Windows-based laptop. The other is a MacBook, which is what I'm recording on right now because I'm not utilizing the podcast equipment. So the MacBook works better this way. But yeah, I use Riverside FM to record with my guests. I have, however, used Zoom a couple times, and Zoom worked great, but I don't pay for a Zoom account, so the time is limited. That's the only issue I have with Zoom. With Riverside FM, I'm paying for it. It's worked very well for me. The one caveat, though, is I have had a lot of issues. If people aren't familiar with Riverside, sometimes there's some issues getting their microphone and my microphone to sync. There's sometimes a bit of an echo. So I may look at some other platforms still as I continue down the road here. But behind the scenes, everything's recorded through Riverside FM. I utilize Buzzsprout later. So I will edit in Riverside. Once I'm done with the editing process, I take that and I upload it to Buzzsprout. Through Buzzsprout, I am able to make a few more tweaks, add my title to the episode. I go ahead and I add, all the content, season 1, episode 13, those kinds of things. Make sure the title is good. I make sure that I have a very good, accurate description, written out and stuff of what the episode is going to be all about. So all of that's happening in Buzzsprout. before I publish out there to all the other platforms, including my website. So I do have a website. I use Podpage to host my website, and that is jfz411.com. So I have started a blog on the website. So I do have some blog posts now there, as well as, of course, all the podcast episodes. And what's great about the website is that is where I can tie all of my guest information to the episode. Is I do that through my website. So if people visit my website and look at the podcast, they're able to get a glimpse of who that guest is and read the guest bio and all of that, and then connect to the links for that guest as well. So the guest's social media pages or website or whatever is all accessed through my website. So I really appreciate having that capability thus far. I've enjoyed all of it. My behind the scenes isn't overly complicated. I do very little editing. That's one of the main reasons why I don't do video right now. Everything is just audio for my podcast. Although I am considering going into video, maybe for season 2, but we'll see. I think I'm probably going to be wrapping up season 1 here soon. Like I said, I've got episode 13 coming out in a week. A couple more guests to record, so I may stop right at 15 episodes just for this first season, and then start looking at how I want to kick off season 2 in 2024. Let's see. As far as, I think I already mentioned this. Have not been podcasting for long. So how many years? Haven't. It's all happened this year of 2023. I officially kicked off the podcast in October, so it is very new to me. But I guess because I looked into it a couple of years ago, I at least had some ideas on how it should go, and I've been able to hit the ground running fairly quickly. And I'm really happy with what we've done thus far. As far as a favorite podcast to listen to, I got turned on to podcasts a long time ago, but it was like a lot of other people listening to true crime podcasts primarily. So that still is one of my favorite things to listen to, is the true crime podcast. However, now that I've opened myself up more to the world of podcasting and I've had other guests on and stuff like that, there's a lot of different podcasts that I really enjoy listening to. It's hard for me to say that I have a favorite, if you will. I mean, I listen to so many different genres, so it's hard to say what a favorite really is. But I'm pulling up some of the ones that I subscribe to right now, and I'll be honest, if I had to give you guys a favorite one, there's a reason why this one is my favorite. So I'm going to share this one with you. But as I'm pulling this up, because I want to make sure I get the title right, I'll tell you why this one is such a favorite of mine. I don't like to say I'm very religious. I'm very faith-based. I believe in God, pray a lot every day. I'm a Catholic and I do practice. I go to mass regularly. The one that I like the most, the podcast that is a favorite of mine right now, is faith-based podcast. It's called Morning Mindset Daily Christian Devotional. It's by Kerry Green. He's not a Catholic, actually. Kerry Green is just a Christian. He actually is a pastor. I think he had taken some time off, wasn't with a church specifically, and he does the podcast. And so it's called Morning Mindset Daily Christian Devotional by Kerry Green. And what's so awesome about it is it's something you can listen to like every morning just to kind of kick off your day. The majority of his episodes are 6 to 7 minutes long. 6 to 7 minutes. He takes like a scripture verse and he'll read that and elaborate on it, on how it fits our life and how it can fit the day. It's a great way to just kind of, again, get in touch with your faith in the morning, and kind of like, hopefully, for me, it levels out my mind a little bit, shifts my focus on some of the right things. And so that's why it's something I try to listen to every day. And yeah, it's a really good way to kick things off. So a lot of podcasts out there that I'm becoming a fan of, but that's got to be one of my favorites right now. How did I come up with the name of my podcast? I tossed this around multiple times. Ultimately, I just decided to go with Judgment Free Zone because the judgment was that's what scared me. Bottom line is, I had to get past the idea of being judged for me to do this podcast. So Judgment Free Zone is just what it was. It resonated with me so much. I was hoping that as people started to understand what I was trying to do with the podcast, that it would resonate well with them. And so, yeah, that's ultimately why I decided on Judgment Free Zone. I stuck with it. I'm happy that I did.